What am I doing? I'm going through a deck of cards. Welcome to HBTV. I'm Harry Binswanger, the HB in HBTV. And today our subject is climate change is no big deal. So is this the deal that I'm doing? No, I'm going through a deck of cards, 52 cards. I'm about halfway now to illustrate the passage of time. It was 52 years ago, January 1970, that, well, I still got about 10 left, but let's put that down. That Newsweek magazine came out with this issue, The Ravaged Environment. I'm going to go through many interesting things in this amazing 1970 magazine, but here's the quote that is the money quote. Some scientists like to play with the notion that global disaster may result if environmental pollution continues unchecked. According to one scenario, the planet is already well advanced toward a phenomenon called the greenhouse effect. Concentrations of carbon dioxide are building up in the atmosphere, it is said, as the world's vegetation, which feeds on CO2, is progressively chopped down. Did you know that the world's vegetation was being progressively chopped down in 1970? That's why the Earth is now one big parking lot. Hanging in the atmosphere, that is carbon dioxide, hanging in the atmosphere is a barrier trapping the planet's heat. As a result, the greenhouse theorists contend, the world is threatened with a rise in average temperature, which, if it reached 4 or 5 degrees, and it hasn't come anywhere near that, hasn't come to half a degree. Well, from when? I looked at since 1900. I think it's come a degree since 1900 as far as you can determine from the data. Which, if it reached 4 or 5 degrees, could melt the polar ice caps, raise sea level by as much as 300 feet, and cause a worldwide flood. 52 years ago. 52 years ago. Remember the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Climate Panel on Climate Change, 1990, 1991, 1992, 30 years ago, predicted near certain disaster in the pretty immediate future. They were never able to pin down precise numbers because it was based upon statistics. But we're 30 years from that one, 52 years from the Newsweek report. And one of my two major points is you don't need to be a climate scientist. You don't need to go in and look, as I have, at the debates on what's up with that versus real climate versus climate audit. You don't have to read the books pro and con on global warming. You can use your common sense. What does your common sense tell you about the global climate? Well, has any city that you know of changed its climate significantly in, the last 100 years? So go back to 1922. Was Paris, France in 1922, a frigid place, and now it's a fairly temperate place? No. Was it not hot in summer in Florida in 1922? No, it's about what it is now. What about Buenos Aires? What about Tokyo? What about Saigon? What about any city on the planet that you can think of? Have any of them noticeably changed their climate in 100 years? Well, no. I mean, people tell you, what do they call it? The farming season, the growing season is starting a couple of weeks earlier. The press says the hottest years on record are in the 21st century. Well, it's not really true, but we don't have to debate that because you're living it. Are you finding, geez, New York City used to be not like Florida, but now New York City is like Florida. And Florida, where I am, is uninhabitable. Or, it used to be cold in Toronto, but now the winters are mild and it rarely gets down below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The climate has really changed. Or has any of the islands that you've seen the reports on in the media from 15, 20 years ago, these islands are disappearing. They're sinking under the water. Have any of them sunk? No. What about sea levels? They've risen. Has it been catastrophic? Has some kind of tsunami rolled down from the North Pole? No. And that's 100 years or 32 years, 30 years, however you want to count it from. Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, inconveniently, was 16 years ago. Wouldn't you think that after 16 years from that movie, which is way, way late in the environmentalist crusade and the climate change catastrophism, that something will be showing up? Well, hurricanes and storms are worse, aren't they? No, they're not. And this leads to the other point. Let me read another point from the Newsweek article, which shocked me. If I can find it. Here it is. For weeks, it was an open secret at the White House that Richard M. Nixon, remember Richard M. Nixon was president? You probably are too young to remember his presidency. It was an open secret at the White House that Richard M. Nixon shares the widespread conviction that the overriding national and international issue of the new decade, the decade from 1970 to 1980, the new decade, is the burgeoning threat to the Earth's environment. It's burgeoning, folks. Just 52 years ago, Richard Nixon made it #1 priority. As Biden has also said, the #1 problem that he's dedicated to fighting is climate catastrophe. Back then, it was also pollution, and there's a lot of stories in here about Lake Erie is dead. That was something that was an accepted fact back then. It turned out not to be true, or else it revivified very quickly. So pollution was more the bait back then than it is now. Now it's climate change. So what is the worst that climate change threatens us with? Give us your best shot, climate scientist. This is why I call it climate change is no big deal. Well, I was in a discussion with some MIT classmates from in a kind of Zoom reunion, and one of them, who's a rabid environmentalist, came up with wildfires in California. Now, I think those wildfires are due to things other than California becoming dry. It wasn't dry, it was extremely wet last year, at least in Southern California. But let's say, okay, there are going to be more forest fires. So for that, we have to commit suicide? For that, we have number one priority in every leader of the state's mind is stop the forest fires. Forget war, forget hunger, forget progress, forget approving things that promise to cure cancer, which are on the horizon. Forest fires. Forest fires are the thing. And they're raging, really? Where? I mean, how big a problem is that? It's a problem. Yeah, and so is acne. And so is gas prices. And so are a lot of other things. What about rising sea level? Al Gore says that he said in 2016, it's going to change the coastline of the United States. Florida, where I live, is going to be underwater. Well, the seas are rising, and things are getting warmer very slowly. They have been since the end of the Little Ice Age in the 1700s. And I assume they will continue for a while. A trend in motion stays in motion unless something stops it. And part of it may even be due to the effluence of carbon dioxide. Not very likely that it has a significant impact on an insignificant thing. But anyway, the sea levels are rising a little bit every year. And it comes very slowly. It's not accelerating. And you know it's not accelerating because you can go to the beach and see it. You can look at the houses. You can look at Al Gore's condo, which he bought at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, right on the bay. Yeah, you can, if you make a mark, you can tell in a few years that the seas have come up a little. Do you know that Holland has been below sea level since the 1600s? And with the technology of 1600s, 1700s, they built dikes that keep the sea from overrunning the land of Holland. So here again, let's say we can't do that, right? And the sea levels are going to creep up, and every 10 years, the houses on the coast will have to be moved further inland or something, or you have to abandon your vacation home after 10 years if you're right on the beach at a low-lying area. How is that the biggest threat to mankind? Even if it's all the coastline of all the nations of the world, the water's slowly getting up, creeping higher and higher. How is that going to compare to the other problems? The problems of dictatorship, the problem of China threatening and Russia threatening nuclear destruction. So what they really need to gain our attention, to impress me anyway, is something to wipe out, a quarter of the human race. Something that would be a big scourge, not forest fires and beachfront homes eventually become uninhabitable. Now, Al Gore was smart enough to project a 20 feet rise, it would take, according to the kind of statistics these people use, I don't need them, it'd take maybe 150 years to get there. But don't you think it's a little more important that we extend the human lifespan so that I don't have to die? Don't you think it's, and when I say we, I mean that scientists are not stopped by the government from testing the things that they have already discovered that could not only extend my lifespan, but return me to youth? There is research indicating that you can manipulate the genome to make it pluripotent again, to make the cells able to divide like they did in the womb and replace organs. But maybe you don't believe that. How about just adding 20 years onto the average lifespan? Isn't that a much, 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 much bigger deal than coastal homes having to be abandoned after 30 years or some large number of years because the waters have crept up? I think it is. And look at the terminology. This is so revealing. This is a confession of bankruptcy on the part of the environmentalists. What I'm going to tell you. You remember when it was called global warming, and at a certain point that was dropped, and climate change was the preferred term. Why? Because the global warming was not happening, or was happening so slowly that no one cared. But with climate change, any change up or down is what they predicted. Hurricanes, earthquakes, probably anything that happens, we told you. But in fact, if you just think of your own personal knowledge of your environment, if you've been living on this planet for 30 or 40 years, and if you read stories set in, 80 or 100 years ago, there hasn't been any damn significant climate change, despite the greenhouse theory being 52 years old to be at the level Newsweek covers it. So what is going on here? Ayn Rand, as usual, caught on to this real early. This is from 1970, February 1970, a month after the Newsweek issue. It's entitled The Left, Old and New. And she says, quoting from 2 paragraphs, "There was a time when the necessity of industrialization was the crusading slogan of Western liberals, which justified anything and whitewashed any atrocity, including the wholesale slaughter in Soviet Russia. We do not hear that slogan any longer. Confronted with the choice of an industrial civilization or collectivism, it is industrial civilization the liberals discarded. Confronted with the choice of technology or dictatorship, it is technology that they discarded. Confronted with the choice of reason or whims, it is reason that they discarded. The old line Marxists used to claim that a single modern factory could produce enough shoes to provide for the whole population of the world, and that nothing but capitalism prevented it. When they discovered the facts of reality involved, they declared that going barefoot is superior to wearing shoes." That is the motive and the aim of the environmentalist climate change people, not the rank and file, but the leadership. And it's all over this Newsweek issue. It's an attack on man himself. Here's one, I got several sections from it. Until a few years ago, fighting pollution ranked somewhere below giving to charity on the list of corporate priorities. Now that is changing. American industry at long last is beginning to move, meaning to move in the direction of controls and stopping. Well, you might think, okay, so they put on catalytic converters. No, it's much deeper than that. Seen from the black depths of space, the Earth is a lovely blue and white stippled island in the archipelago of the planets. It is unique with its surface wetted by water, cushioned by greenery, and fanned by air. Close up, the Earth, and particularly that part of the landmass occupied by the United States, presents a far different picture. For example, fishermen in Colorado cast for trout among the beer cans, and debris falling into the Eagle River from an open dump on the bank. American women carry in their breast milk that has anywhere from 3 to 10 times more of the pesticide DDT than the federal government allows in dairy milk meant for human consumption. DDT, by the way, is completely harmless. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio is so overrun with volatile industrial discharges that last summer it caught fire and burned 2 railroad trestles. Such is the home of the most technically advanced population on Earth. How did man go wrong? Well, we know how. He didn't adopt Marxism. He didn't adopt dictatorship. He didn't place reason at the subservience of nightmare fantasy. Growth has traditionally been considered a blessing, and nowhere has this been truer than in the United States. America offered its colonists natural resources in wild profusion and vast spaces to move around in. Boy, I bet they were thrilled. They got here and, boy, look at all the space to move around in. We don't have any food. We have very few items of clothing. We only have a few axes and saws, but look at the spaces here. Wild profusion. Abundance encouraged prodigality. If you happen to exhaust the riches of one spot, you simply moved on to another. Oh, really? Is that what happened? Is that the history of America? So we didn't get richer. The cars were always here. The synthetic clothes that I'm wearing were always here. The mirrorless camera I'm using was always here. The internet was always here, even before Al Gore. But it was in places that we moved on. We used it up, and then we moved on. Can you imagine the mindset of somebody who makes a statement like that? What's more, and here we get to the ethical essence, the society's system of rewards, favored the man who produced more, who found new ways to exploit nature. There were no riches or prestige for the men who made a deliberate decision to leave well enough alone. In this case, his environment. This worship of growth, now, is very bad, they're saying. A number of today's environmental reformers conclude that mankind's main hope lies not in technology, but in abstinence. fewer births and less gadgetry. Like the gadgetry that enables me to talk to you now and you to hear it. The gadgetry that keeps me able to live in Florida, where it's on my Apple Watch. I see, okay, get it in the camera. I see that it's 90 degrees outside, but it's only 78, I said it warm, inside because of air conditioning. Oh, no, abstinence, sweat it out, move out of Florida, crowd in the cities. Paul Ehrlich, president of a group called Zero Population Growth, Inc., tries to persuade couples that it is irresponsible to have more than 2 children. 1970, no integrated circuit, no computers except for huge mainframes that were inaccessible. You never saw a computer. You, the average person, never saw a computer in your life if you were alive up until 1970. No internet, no phones, cell phones. Remember the old dial phones or touch? The big innovation was you push buttons to dial rather than turning, as it did a few years earlier, turning a rotary dial, as it was called. So that was good enough. Well, these people are anticipated. The man-haters of 1970 were anticipated by the grandfather of the man-haters from 400 BC, Plato. Plato in the Republic has Socrates say, people are, the same exact thing, people are consumed by desire for luxury. They want to have beds rather than sleep on branches of myrtle boughs. They want to have plates rather than eat off of baked earth. It's a desire for luxury, and it's no damn good. We don't need that. John Stuart Mill wrote in about 1840 that technology has gone far enough. There's enough wealth now. We don't need any more. It's just pride and gluttony that makes us want to have more advances than there were when he wrote in 1840. And of course, forget that those 1840 standard of living in London, where he was not matched anywhere else in the world, not even in the United States, which had not caught its stride yet. So 99% of the world's population lived with constant hunger. Famines were only ended around that time as a recurrent phenomenon. So something is operating here other than science and reason. It's a hatred for man that goes back to philosophy, to Platonism and Christianity, of which Marx is the current incarnation. Not current, he's 150 years ago. Marx was the still popular incarnation and secularization of Christian ethics. The Sermon on the Mount is, without God, Marx's ethical philosophy. And it's the ethical philosophy of Piketty, the egalitarian from France, who wrote the modern, Capital, doing a riff on Das Kapital of Karl Marx. Of the woke and progressives, it's all about fear and holding man down and not celebrating material progress, being anti-technology, leave well enough alone. That is considered the height of morality, to not produce. And by the way, I meant to point out, the system of rewards, which means society's system of reward, in other words, property rights, favored the man who produced more. Well, my God, how unjust, right? You produce more, you have more. That's not fair. The people who produce less should have some of that, by virtue of the fact that they didn't produce more. So production is what we need, but we're going to punish it. You produce and you lose your rights. You don't produce and you gain a claim on other people's production. The system of rewards favors those who produce more. I mean, it is just staggering. I'm over time, and I wanted to take up at least one chat question, because one of them, we have some carried over, and one of them has impressed me. I'm having a little, oh, there it is. Does it ever frustrate you how the rest of the culture is still debating the validity of arithmetic while objectivists are discussing calculus? Yes, yes. And this is a theme of mine, that Ayn Rand's philosophy and her writings have so much more content than the professional philosophers have ever come up with, that it's a joke that they claim, oh, it's not a philosophy. The philosophers argue with each other about minutiae, while Ayn Rand is solving the age-old problem of universals, coming up with a new and deeper theory of free will, proving the supposedly unprovable connection between is and ought, showing what the basis is in ethics for the rights of the individual, defining a new concept of art. And it's not just the breadth, it's the detail, the richness, the content of her work that is so much vast, so much more ramified and serious and just contentful than what you get in academic philosophy. And that does, I'm going to take a second to answer, tie it in with another question. Stingy student. Stingy student says, there are many interesting pieces in contemporary analytic philosophy on denoting two dogmas of empiricism, a defense of common sense, the manifest image, I don't know what that is, and the scientific image. But let's just take one or two of these. On denoting is Bertrand Russell's argument about, what are we saying when we say, if somebody says the present king of France is bald? There is no king of France at present. They haven't had a king for hundreds of years. So if you say the present king, you know, it could be America, but he was English. The present king of America is bald, but there is no present king. So how are we to make sense of that? And he doesn't have much to say. He's answered by P.F. Strawson in a pretty good piece, who says, a statement has presuppositions. So a statement like, the present king of France is bald, has a false presupposition. Oh, thank you, that's right. But where are you guys coming from? Where's your theory of concepts? Where's your theory of perception and the validity of the senses? Where's your theory of causality? Now let's take another one. Two dogmas of empiricism. Quine's attack on the analytic synthetic dichotomy. Quine's two dogmas are that you can make a distinction, you can define synonymy, and you can make a distinction between analytic and synthetic because the two concepts are related. And his argument comes down to, well, no one has ever really defined these things. So you can say, well, two concepts are synonymous if they have the same meaning, but what's the meaning? We don't know. You can say two concepts have the same meaning if they have the same referent, but how do you determine what the referents are of the concept unless you already know what it means? I'm not sure that's his argument, but that's the style. I haven't read Two Dogmas for, I don't know, 20 years, but I've read it a few times. He opens this collection with the problem of God in this way. It's an essay entitled On What There Is. And he says, some people want to deny there is a God, but they can't do it because if you say God does not exist, doesn't there have to be a referent for the term God? What is it that doesn't exist? Well, God, you know. But you assume, therefore, there is a God in order to deny him. And it's not about religion in particular. It's, somebody says square circles don't exist. Well, what is a square circle? You assume they exist to talk about them and say they don't exist. Now, that is from one of the most revered philosopher of the 20th century. He was at Harvard. He was acknowledged to be one of the greats. Another one, well, okay, I won't go. So these kind of silly games are what pass for philosophy in the analytic tradition. Ayn Rand, meanwhile, is writing on the foundations of each of the branches of philosophy, the axioms that found metaphysics, and how they're not propositions, they're axiomatic concepts, which is a new idea. I don't believe anyone has said that before. It's kind of implicit in Aristotle, but no one realizes that. The foundation of epistemology in sense perception, and why there is a distinction between the form and the object of perception, and how that solves all the difficulties that have been raised against the validity of senses. How you get from sense perception to concepts. How you get from original concepts to higher concepts. Why concepts exist in a hierarchy. Why all knowledge exists as a hierarchy. Why you can define a standard of morality. Why good and evil are facts based upon a fundamental choice, the choice to live. Why Kant was wrong to say morality is subjective if it's all hypothetical, not categorical, and that's why he has the categorical imperative. I mean, I could go on, and I've probably gone on too long. So it's an angering joke that the profession affects this attitude. Oh, well, objectivism is not a philosophy. When what they regard as philosophy is beneath comic books. I can't resist one more. Another Harvard philosopher, Nelson Goodman, raised the new problem of induction. He said, what if we define grue, G-R-U-E, to mean something that is green when observed before the year, and then he picked 2000, but we passed that now, so let's say 2100. And blue, the same thing, blue if observed after the year 2100. Well, all the evidence that emeralds are green, all of our inspection in science, is equally evidence for emeralds are grue, which would mean when we look at them after the year 2100, the term green will no longer, the term GRU will no longer apply to them. So that will, no, it will apply to them, and green won't apply to them. I forget. So there's GRU and there's BLEAN, and there's BAGLEET. What is BLEAN is blue before and green after. What is BAGLEET? He says, I'll use the term BAGLEET to mean anything that's a bag of marbles on my desk or a naval fleet. And then he points out difficulties we get into with that kind of predicate. Now, is that beneath comic books? All right. So that's my answer is yes, I am incensed, outraged at the garbage that is called serious philosophy. And meanwhile, the rich detail, whether you agree with it or not, the rich, detailed, fundamental, original philosophical ideas integrated into a system that Ayn Rand gave us. So with that, I will summarize the non-chat part, non-question answering part as, why are we saying that heaven and earth have to be turned to stop something that hasn't happened over the 52 years it's been proclaimed to be imminent, and which the worst scenarios are a gradual rise in sea level and more, maybe more hurricanes and some more forest fire. Now, you know, there are scenarios that are worse, like desert forming in certain places, but then there would be non-desert forming in the desert. So there isn't anything that technology can't solve, and there isn't anything to get all agitated and excited about. Plus, I happen to think the whole thing is, there's no catastrophe. There is some slight warming, and I think people want that. I wrote an article for Forbes magazine saying global warming, back when you could call it that. A beautiful dream, but only a dream. People want warmer climates. That's why they move from the colder regions to the warmer regions. It's been going on for 50 years, the same 52 years that disasters have been predicted. The North loses population, the South in America gains population because people want warmth. Okay, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next week on HBTV.